Mary Ann McDougall was no stranger to hard work. After years of bouncing from one rented apartment to another, struggling to establish her own small business in natural skin care, she had finally found a place she could call her own, or at least, one she could afford to rent long-term. It wasn't a typical house, but rather a well-kept mobile home, nestled on a quiet patch of land near the edge of a forest. The spot was perfect for her lifestyle. It was peaceful, surrounded by nature, and provided just the right environment for growing the herbs she used in her products. Plus, the rent was reasonable. She had struck a deal with an elderly landowner named Mr. Brown, who didn't mind her living there as long as she took care of the property. For Mary Ann, this was the fresh start she had been dreaming of. The mobile home wasn't large, but it was cozy and functional. She had set up a small workspace in one corner, where she made everything from herbal balms to organic soaps, carefully packaging each product by hand. Outside, she'd planted rows of lavender, chamomile, and mint, creating a small but thriving garden. In her mind, it was more than just a home. It was her sanctuary, her livelihood, and her future. That morning, like any other, she went out early to check on her plants. The dew still clung to the leaves, and the air was crisp and fresh. After tending to her garden, she decided to go for a quick run along the nearby forest trail before starting work for the day. Running always helped her clear her mind, and on days like this, when everything felt calm and under control, she could almost forget the years of instability she had endured before finding this place. Life wasn't perfect, but it was finally looking up. When she returned to the clearing where her mobile home should have been, she stopped dead in her tracks. For a moment, she thought she must have taken a wrong turn. But that wasn't possible. She knew these trails by heart. No, she was standing exactly where her home should be, but it was gone. All that remained was an empty patch of dirt and grass, bordered by a newly erected metal fence. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step closer, eyes scanning the area for any sign of her belongings. There was nothing, no mobile home, no garden, not even the small tool shed she had put up behind the house. It was as if everything she owned had been wiped clean off the earth. Her breath quickened, and she forced herself to focus. Maybe there had been some sort of mistake, a mix-up with the landowner. She pulled out her phone and called Mr. Brown. He answered on the third ring, his voice as calm and friendly as always. "Mr. Brown, it's Mary Ann. Something's wrong. My home, it's gone. Someone took everything, and there's a fence here now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Mr. Brown replied, sounding genuinely puzzled. "What do you mean, gone?" "I didn't authorize anything like that. The land's still yours to rent, as far as I'm concerned." Mary Ann's mind raced. If Brown hadn't ordered the removal, then who had? And more importantly, where was her home? "There's a fence here now," she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "It looks like someone's trying to take over the land." Mr. Brown let out a sigh. "You know, a couple of days ago, some people came by asking if I wanted to sell the whole lot. I told them no, of course. Maybe they didn't like my answer." Mary Ann felt a chill run down her spine. Could it be possible that these people had decided to take matters into their own hands? It sounded ridiculous, almost like something out of a bad movie, but here she was, standing on an empty plot of land where her home used to be. She thanked Mr. Brown and hung up, her mind spinning with questions. Who were these people? How had they managed to remove her entire home without anyone noticing? And what could she do now? She walked around the perimeter of the fence, searching for any clues. The fence was brand new, its posts driven deep into the ground, and it encircled the entire clearing where her home had stood. There was a small sign attached to one of the posts that read, "Private property, no trespassing." Beneath that, in smaller print, was a note indicating that any inquiry should be directed to the local territorial management office. This had to be some sort of mistake, she told herself. Maybe it was a bureaucratic error, some mix-up with land records that had caused her property to be targeted by accident. But deep down she knew it was more than that. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to put up this fence and make her disappear, and they weren't going to give up easily. Determined to get to the bottom of things, she made her way back to the main road and drove into town. Her first stop was the local municipal office, where she explained her situation to a bored-looking clerk behind the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, listened without much interest before typing something into her computer. "Ah, yes," the clerk said after a moment. "That area was recently redesignated as part of a new development project. You'll have to speak with the organization managing it. They're the ones who put up the fence." Mary Ann clenched her fists, struggling to keep her frustration in check. "But I have a lease. I've been living there for months. How can they just take my home?" The clerk shrugged. "You'll have to take it up with them. I can give you the contact information." Mary Ann accepted the slip of paper the clerk handed her, but she felt no closer to a solution. Whoever these people were, they clearly had the power to make her disappear overnight, and she was just one woman trying to stand in their way. Still, she wasn't about to give up. She had worked too hard to build a life for herself, and she wasn't going to let it be taken away without a fight. Driving back from the municipal office, Mary Ann's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping over her. How could something like this happen so suddenly and without warning? She had spent months building her life on that plot of land, turning it into both her home and her place of work. It wasn't much by conventional standards, but to her, it had meant stability. Now it was gone, just like that, and all she had to go on was a slip of paper with contact information for some management organization she had never heard of before. The name on the paper was generic, something like Westland Property Management. The kind of name that gave no indication of who was behind it or what they actually did. But whoever they were, they had the means to put up a fence and haul away an entire mobile home overnight. Mary Ann decided to call the number right away. After a few rings, she was met with an automated voice directing her to leave a message or visit their local office during business hours. Frustrated, she hung up without leaving a message. Something about the whole situation felt off. It wasn't just the sudden disappearance of her home, it was the way it had been done so quietly, so efficiently, without even a hint of trouble, until she returned to find it all gone. Someone had planned this carefully, and whoever they were confident enough to act as if she didn't exist. Her next stop was the address listed for the management office. It was located in a strip mall on the outskirts of town, tucked between a dry cleaner and a payday loan store. The office looked unremarkable from the outside, just another bland, corporate storefront with tinted windows and a door marked with their logo in blocky white letters. Inside, the waiting area was sparsely furnished, with a couple of plastic chairs and a front desk manned by a young receptionist who barely glanced up as Mary Ann entered. "Hi, I'm here to speak with someone about a property issue," Mary Ann said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the rising tension in her chest. I lived on a piece of land that your company has apparently fenced off. I need to know what's going on." The receptionist gave her a brief, uninterested look before typing something into the computer in front of her. "Name." "Mary Ann McDougal," she said, her patience thinning. "The property is right on the edge of town, near the forest." The receptionist tapped at the keyboard for a moment before nodding. "Wait here. Someone will be with you shortly." Mary Ann sat down in one of the plastic chairs, her mind racing with questions. After what felt like an eternity, a door at the back of the office opened, and a woman in a smart gray suit stepped out. She was in her late 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a cold, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miss McDougal, I'm Karen Whitmore, Regional Manager for Westland Property Management. I understand you have some questions about your former residence." Mary Ann stood, trying to steady her nerves. "Yes. I want to know why my home was removed and why there's suddenly a fence around the property. I have a valid lease agreement with Mr. Brown, the owner of that land." Karen's smile didn't waver. If anything, it seemed to harden slightly at the mention of the lease. "I'm afraid there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. You see, that plot of land was recently acquired as part of a new residential development project. We reached out to the previous owner, Mr. Brown, and he agreed to sell the property to us. As such, any existing arrangements you may have had are no longer valid." Mary Ann felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. "That can't be right. I just spoke to Mr. Brown this morning, and he said he didn't sell the land." Karen gave a small shrug, as if to say that wasn't her concern. Perhaps he wasn't aware of the finalization of the transaction. In any case, the sale is complete, and Westland now has full legal authority over the property. I understand this must be a difficult time for you, but we are simply following the procedures outlined by local regulations. Difficult time? That was an understatement. Mary Ann clenched her fists, trying to control her anger. You can't just take someone's home without notice. I didn't even receive a warning. One day my home is there, and the next it's gone. How is that legal? Karen's smile tightened, her expression growing more condescending by the second. As I said, Miss McDougal, we are operating fully within the bounds of the law. Notices were sent to the registered address on file, but since the property has changed hands, we are not obligated to continue any pre-existing agreements. I suggest you speak with a legal professional if you wish to pursue the matter further. Mary Ann opened her mouth to argue, but she stopped herself. She could see that arguing with Karen wouldn't get her anywhere. This woman wasn't going to admit to any wrongdoing, and she certainly wasn't going to help. If anything, she seemed to be enjoying Mary Ann's frustration. Realizing she was wasting her time, Mary Ann gave a curt nod and turned to leave. But as she reached the door, Karen called out one last thing. Oh, and Miss McDougal, if you'd like to recover your belongings, you'll need to pay a storage fee. Your mobile home is being held at one of our storage facilities. I can provide you with the details if you'd like. Mary Ann spun around, her eyes narrowing. A storage fee? You took my home without warning, and now you're charging me to get it back. Karen shrugged again, as if the answer were obvious. We have expenses to cover. The fee is non-negotiable. For a moment, Mary Ann considered storming back into the office and demanding to see some sort of documentation proving they had the right to do what they'd done, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't going to help, and standing there arguing would only make things worse. Instead, Mary Ann turned and walked out, her mind already working on her next move. Back in her car, she took a few deep breaths to steady herself. She needed to think clearly if she was going to handle this situation. The first step was obvious: she needed to find a lawyer. If Karen thought she could bully her into paying some ridiculous fee, she was wrong. Mary Ann wasn't about to give up without a fight. But even as she made the call to a local attorney's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just a misunderstanding or a simple land dispute. Something about the way Karen had acted, so smug and sure of herself, suggested that there was more going on than Mary Ann knew. She didn't have all the pieces yet, but one thing was certain: whoever these people were, they weren't used to being challenged, and Mary Ann was about to change that. Mary Ann sat quietly in her car for a moment, the phone pressed to her ear as she waited for someone to pick up on the other end. She had found the number of a local attorney who specialized in property disputes through a quick online search. After what felt like an eternity, a receptionist finally answered, sounding busy and hurried. Mary Ann quickly explained her situation, making sure to mention that her mobile home had been taken without warning and that the land was supposedly sold without proper notification. The receptionist transferred her to one of the firm's junior attorneys, a young man named Peter Harris. Peter was polite but straightforward, asking Mary Ann to recount the events in detail. As she explained what had happened, the sudden disappearance of her home, the fence, the evasive responses from Karen, and now the demand for a storage fee, she could hear him scribbling down notes. Once she finished, Peter took a moment before responding. This situation sounds complicated but not uncommon in cases of disputed land ownership. If the property was truly sold to Westland Property Management, and they acted under the assumption that they now own the land, they may have some legal grounds for what they did, assuming they followed proper protocol. However, the lack of notification to you is a major red flag. You mentioned that Mr. Brown, your landlord, denied selling the land. Are you certain he didn't agree to anything in writing or verbally that could have led to this? I'm sure, Mary Ann said firmly. He's always been straightforward with me, and he was just as surprised as I was when I told him what happened. He said people from the company came to him with an offer, but he refused. Peter sighed on the other end of the line. Okay, that helps narrow things down. It's possible they're trying to pressure him into selling, and removing your home was a way to force both of you out of the picture. If that's the case, we might have a stronger argument. What I'd recommend is twofold. First, we need to request a formal title search to see if any sale has actually been recorded with the county. If there's no official record of a transaction, their claim of ownership won't hold up. Second, we'll issue a demand letter to Westland, asking them to either provide proof of ownership or immediately return your home without any storage fees. Does that sound like a reasonable plan to you? Yes, it does. Thank you, Marianne replied, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. How soon can we get started? I'll need you to come into the office tomorrow to sign some documents. Once we've got your written authorization, we can proceed with the title search and draft the demand letter. I'll also need copies of your lease agreement with Mr. Brown and any correspondence you've had regarding the property. Marianne promised to gather everything and thanked Peter again before ending the call. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment to collect herself. The legal process would take time, but at least she was doing something. For now, that would have to be enough. The next morning, Marianne arrived at Peter's office bright and early, clutching a folder containing her lease agreement and several emails she had exchanged with Mr. Brown over the past few months. The office was small but professional, with framed certificates lining the walls and a faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. Peter greeted her warmly and walked her through the necessary paperwork, explaining each step in simple terms. He was efficient, and within half an hour everything was in order. As she prepared to leave, Peter assured her that he would keep her updated on any developments. Feeling slightly more at ease, Marianne decided to stop by Mr. Brown's house on her way home. She wanted to let him know what the attorney had said and see if he had learned anything new. Mr. Brown lived in a modest one-story home a few miles outside town, surrounded by towering oak trees. As she pulled into his driveway, he came out onto the porch, a concerned expression on his face. "Marianne, good to see you," he said, motioning for her to come up. "I was just about to call you. Something strange happened this morning." "What do you mean?" she asked, her pulse quickening. Mr. Brown handed her a crumpled letter. It was from Westland Property Management, informing him that the sale of his land had been finalized and that he needed to vacate the premises within 30 days. Marianne scanned the letter, her heart sinking. "This doesn't make any sense. You didn't agree to sell, right?" "Of course not," Mr. Brown said firmly. "But look at this," he pointed to a line at the bottom of the letter, where it mentioned a verbal agreement between him and a representative from Westland. "They're claiming I gave them permission to move forward based on a verbal agreement." "That's a lie." Marianne felt a surge of anger. This was more than just a misunderstanding, it was a blatant attempt to strong-arm both her and Mr. Brown into giving up their rights. "Don't worry," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I've already hired a lawyer. He's going to do a title search and send them a demand letter. We're not going to let them get away with this." Mr. Brown nodded, but his worry was evident. "Be careful, Marianne. These people don't play fair. If they're willing to lie about something like this, there's no telling what else they'll do." She knew he was right. As she drove back to her temporary lodging, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get worse before they got better. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. She had always prided herself on being self-reliant, but this was a battle she couldn't fight alone. She needed allies, and fast. The following day, Peter called her with the first bit of news. The title search came back clean, he said. "There's no record of any sale or transfer of ownership. Legally, Mr. Brown still owns the land." Marianne felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived as Peter continued. "That's the good news. The bad news is that they're likely banking on delaying tactics. By the time we prove they don't own the land, they could have caused enough disruption to force Mr. Brown to sell out of frustration." "So what do we do?" she asked, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "We escalate. I've drafted the demand letter, and I'll be sending it to them today. If they don't respond or refuse to cooperate, we can file an injunction to stop them from interfering with the property further. It's a bit of a legal chess game, but we've got the stronger position for now." Marianne thanked him and hung up, feeling both hopeful and anxious. She knew this was far from over, but at least she had taken the first step. Now, It was a matter of staying one step ahead of Westland and whoever was behind this scheme. Mary Ann barely slept that night, her mind turning over every possible outcome. Even with a lawyer on her side and a clean title search proving that Mr. Brown still legally owned the land, something didn't sit right. Westland's aggressive tactics made it clear that they weren't just relying on bureaucratic loopholes. They were willing to lie, intimidate, and manipulate to get what they wanted. It wasn't just about her mobile home anymore, it was about control. They had made their move, and now it was up to her to keep pushing back. The next morning, she received a call from Mr. Brown. His voice was tense. "Mary Ann, you might want to come by. Something strange is going on here." She didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing her keys, she headed straight to his house. When she arrived, she saw two unfamiliar cars parked outside his property. Mr. Brown was standing on the porch, arms crossed, glaring at the two men in suits standing near the edge of his yard. As Mary Ann got out of her car, one of the men turned and gave her a cold, appraising look. "They showed up about half an hour ago," Mr. Brown explained quietly as she joined him. "Claimed they're here to inspect the land as part of the development project. I told them they had no right to be here without permission, but they said they didn't need it." Mary Ann felt her frustration boiling over. "Have they shown you any documentation?" Mr. Brown shook his head. "Just a lot of fancy talk about how they're acting in accordance with local regulations." Determined to take control of the situation, Mary Ann approached the two men. "Excuse me," she said firmly, "but you're trespassing. This land belongs to Mr. Brown, and unless you have a court order or some other legal authorization, you have no right to be here." The older of the two men, a tall, thin figure with a well-tailored suit, gave her a condescending smile. "We're simply conducting a preliminary survey. It's standard procedure when preparing for a new development. We have no intention of causing trouble." "Standard procedure," Mary Ann repeated incredulously. "There's no development happening here because this land hasn't been sold. The title is still in Mr. Brown's name, and you have no authority to be conducting anything here. Now, unless you want us to call the police, I suggest you leave." The man's smile faltered slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he exchanged a glance with his colleague, then nodded. "Very well. We'll be back once this matter is resolved. Good day." As they walked back to their cars and drove off, Mary Ann let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said to Mr. Brown. "They want you to feel overwhelmed and give up." Mr. Brown sighed heavily. "It's working. I'm too old for this kind of fight, Mary Ann. They're banking on me not having the energy or resources to keep pushing back." She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're not in this alone. We'll fight them together." Still, as she drove away from Mr. Brown's house, she couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Westland wasn't playing fair, and she had no doubt they were already planning their next move. She needed to be ready. Later that afternoon, Peter called with an update. "I sent the demand letter to Westland, and they responded almost immediately. They're claiming they have a verbal agreement with Mr. Brown that predates your lease, which, according to them, gives them the right to begin preliminary development work. Obviously, that's nonsense. But it's clear they're not going to back down without a fight." "What happens next?" Mary Ann asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll file an injunction to prevent them from conducting any further activities on the land until this is resolved in court. It should buy us some time. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping an eye on the property. If they try anything, document it. Even if they're acting without proper authorization, they could still claim they were given implied consent unless we have proof to the contrary." Mary Ann thanked him and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. At least they had a plan. But knowing Westland, they weren't going to sit quietly and wait for the legal process to play out. Sure enough, 2 days later she got a frantic call from Mr. Brown. "They're back," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "This time they brought construction equipment. They're saying they have the right to start clearing the land." "I'm on my way," Mary Ann replied, already grabbing her keys. When she arrived, she found a small crew gathered at the edge of the property. A bulldozer idled nearby, and a few workers were marking off sections of the land with bright orange flags. Standing off to the side, giving orders, was none other than Karen Whitmore. Mary Ann marched straight up to her, ignoring the curious glances from the workers. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. Karen turned, her expression as smug as ever. "Oh, Miss McDougal. How nice of you to join us. As I mentioned before, we have every right to proceed with development. We've given Mr. Brown ample time to vacate, and since he has failed to do so, we're moving forward." "That's a lie, and you know it," Mary Ann shot back. "There's no sale, no transfer of ownership, and no legal basis for any of this. I've already hired a lawyer, and we're filing an injunction. If you don't stop right now, you'll be facing serious legal consequences." Karen's smile didn't waver. "File whatever paperwork you like. By the time it goes through, we'll already have completed the initial clearing. Once the land is altered, it'll be much harder for anyone to dispute our claim." Mary Ann's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted nothing more than to wipe that smug grin off Karen's face, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose her temper. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the equipment, the workers, and Karen herself. "You can try to intimidate us all you want," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "But you're not above the law. We'll see you in court." Karen gave a mock bow. "I look forward to it." With that, she turned and walked away, barking orders at the workers as she went. Mary Ann stayed long enough to make sure she had documented everything, then returned to her car and called Peter. "They're escalating," she said as soon as he picked up. "They've brought in construction equipment and started marking off the land." Karen was there, personally overseeing it. Peter cursed under his breath. "They're trying to get ahead of the injunction. If they can make visible changes to the land, it complicates things legally. But don't worry, we still have the stronger case. I'll expedite the filing and request an emergency hearing. With any luck, we can get a temporary restraining order issued within the next 24 hours. "Is there anything else I can do?" Mary Ann asked. "For now, just keep documenting everything. If they try to pull anything else, we'll need as much evidence as possible." After ending the call, Mary Ann sat in her car for a long moment, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. She had known this fight would be tough, but she hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. Westland wasn't just playing dirty, they were trying to steamroll her and Mr. Brown before they could mount a proper defense. But Mary Ann wasn't about to back down. This was her home, her life, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her, not without a fight. The day after Peter filed for an emergency injunction, Mary Ann woke up feeling slightly more hopeful. The temporary restraining order, if granted, would force Westland to halt all activity on the land until the legal dispute was resolved. It wouldn't be a permanent solution, but it would buy them valuable time. However, that hope began to waver when she received a call from Mr. Brown mid-morning. His voice was tense, laced with frustration and concern. "They came back early this morning," he said, barely concealing his anger. "They didn't bring heavy equipment this time, but they've been staking out the perimeter again. I told them they had no right to be here, but they ignored me. They're acting like they own the place." Mary Ann. Her heart sank. "Did they say anything? Mention who sent them?" "No, they didn't say much of anything. Just went about their business, putting up more of those damn orange flags. One of them handed me another letter before they left. It's from Karen's office, saying I have 7 days to vacate or face further legal action. I don't know what they're trying to pull, but it's clear they're not waiting for the courts to decide anything." Mary Ann clenched her jaw as anger flared in her chest. This was more than just a land grab, it was a blatant attempt to intimidate Mr. Brown into giving up. "Don't do anything rash," she said after a moment. "Let me call Peter and figure out our next move. We've already filed the injunction, so hopefully the court will step in before things escalate further." After hanging up, she immediately dialed Peter's number. He picked up on the second ring, and she wasted no time explaining what had happened. When she finished, Peter let out a frustrated sigh. "They're pushing hard, trying to force Mr. Brown's hand before the legal process can catch up with them. Unfortunately, without the injunction officially in place, they're operating in a gray area. They can't legally evict him. But they can claim they're preparing the land for development as long as they're not doing anything too invasive." "That's ridiculous," Mary Ann snapped. They're clearly trying to bully him into leaving. Isn't there anything we can do to stop them? For now, just keep documenting everything. The restraining order should be issued soon, and once it is, they'll have to back off or face contempt charges. In the meantime, if they return, call the police and file a formal complaint for trespassing. Even if the officers can't do much without the restraining order, it'll help establish a pattern of harassment. Mary Ann thanked him and hung up, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. She wasn't going to let Karen and her cronies win. If they wanted to play dirty, she would meet them head-on, but she would do it the right way legally, methodically, and with the support of people who knew how to fight back. That afternoon, she drove back to Mr. Brown's property to check on him. The orange flags were still there, scattered along the perimeter like garish markers of impending doom. Mr. Brown greeted her with a weary smile, but it was clear the tension was wearing on him. "They've got me on edge," he admitted as they sat on the porch. "I've lived here for over 30 years, Mary Ann. Never had to deal with anything like this before. Feels like they're trying to scare me into running." "That's exactly what they're doing," she agreed. "But you're not alone in this. We've got a good lawyer, and the law is on our side. They're hoping we'll give up before we can fight back, but we're not going to let that happen." Despite her words, Mary Ann couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of unease in her gut. Westland had already shown they were willing to bend or outright ignore the rules to get what they wanted. She had no doubt they would continue to escalate their tactics in the coming days. Her suspicions were confirmed that evening when she returned home and found an envelope taped to her front door. It was unmarked, save for her name scrawled across the front in bold, black letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in plain font. "This isn't your fight. Walk away before it gets worse." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but the message was clear someone wanted her to back off. Mary Ann's hands trembled slightly as she folded the note and shoved it into her pocket. She didn't know if the threat was meant to scare her, or if it was a prelude to something more serious, but either way, she had no intention of backing down. The next morning, she met with Peter in his office to discuss the latest developments. She showed him the note, and his expression darkened as he read it. "This is a clear attempt at intimidation," he said. "It won't hold up in court, but it shows they're feeling the pressure. They wouldn't be resorting to this kind of tactic if they didn't think we had a real chance of stopping them." "Is there anything we can do about it?" she asked. "I'll include it in our case file, but unless they escalate further, it's just another piece of circumstantial evidence. The best thing you can do right now is stay vigilant. Keep documenting everything, and don't engage with them directly if you can avoid it." Mary Ann nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. Over the next few days, her fears were proven right. More workers showed up at Mr. Brown's property, this time with survey equipment and clipboards. They stayed just long enough to mark off a few more sections of the land before leaving, but their presence was enough to keep Mr. Brown on edge. Then, late one night, Mary Ann was jolted awake by the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was Mr. Brown. "They're out here again," he said, his voice low and tense. "It's past midnight and they're poking around with flashlights. I didn't want to call the police until I spoke to you first." "I'm on my way," she said without hesitation, already pulling on her shoes. When she arrived, she found Mr. Brown standing on his porch, a flashlight in hand. He pointed toward the edge of the property, where a pair of figures could be seen moving in the shadows. Mary Ann grabbed her phone and started recording as they approached. "Hey," she called out, her voice cutting through the still night air. "You're trespassing. Get off this property right now, or we're calling the police." The figures froze for a moment before turning and disappearing into the darkness. Mary Ann kept her phone pointed in their direction until they were out of sight, then lowered it with a sigh of relief. "We can't keep doing this," Mr. Brown said quietly. "They're not going to stop." "They will," she assured him, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. "We're going to win this, Mr. Brown. We just have to hold on a little longer." The following morning, Peter called with good news: the emergency injunction had been granted. Westland was now legally barred from conducting any further activities on the land until the court case was resolved. It was a small victory, but an important one. For the first time in days, Mary Ann allowed herself to hope that they might actually have a chance. But even as she celebrated the news, she knew the fight wasn't over. Westland had already shown they were willing to push the limits of the law to get what they wanted. The real battle was just beginning. Mary Ann felt a wave of relief after hearing from Peter that the emergency injunction had been granted. It was the first real victory in what felt like an endless, uphill battle. The court's decision meant that Westland was now legally barred from conducting any further activities on the property until the case was resolved. No more workers, no more heavy machinery, no more late-night intrusions, at least for now. But as much as she wanted to believe that this marked the beginning of the end, a nagging voice in the back of her mind told her otherwise. Westland wasn't going to back down quietly. They had too much at stake. Over the next couple of days, things remained quiet. Mary Ann visited Mr. Brown regularly, and aside from the occasional drive-by from what appeared to be Westland representatives, there was no further escalation. It felt almost too quiet, as if the calm was merely a prelude to something bigger. She tried to relax and focus on her work, but the sense of unease lingered. That unease turned out to be justified when Peter called her unexpectedly one afternoon, his tone serious. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. Westland just filed a motion to have the injunction lifted. They're claiming that the development project is time-sensitive and that any delays will result in significant financial losses. They've also submitted a document alleging that Mr. Brown verbally agreed to vacate the land 6 months ago, and they're using that as grounds to argue that they acted in good faith. Mary Ann's stomach tightened. But that's a lie. Mr. Brown never agreed to anything. "I know," Peter said calmly, "but they're trying to create enough doubt to make the judge reconsider the injunction. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. We need Mr. Brown to testify, and we'll need any evidence you have that contradicts their claim. I have emails from Mr. Brown confirming our lease and conversations where he explicitly said he wasn't selling Mary Ann offered. Will that help?" "It'll help," Peter confirmed. "Bring everything you have. We're going to need to be as prepared as possible." The next day, Mary Ann and Mr. Brown arrived at the courthouse together, both feeling the weight of what was at stake. Westland's legal team was already there, led by none other than Karen Whitmore. She greeted them with a smug smile, clearly confident that her team had the upper hand. Mary Ann ignored her, focusing instead on staying calm and collected. She couldn't afford to let Karen's arrogance get under her skin. The hearing began with Westland's lawyer presenting their case. He painted a picture of a legitimate development project being unfairly delayed by a misunderstanding. He argued that Mr. Brown had verbally agreed to sell the land and that Westland had acted in good faith, only to be met with unexpected resistance. He emphasized the financial impact of the delay and urged the judge to lift the injunction so the project could move forward. When it was Peter's turn, he wasted no time dismantling Westland's argument. He presented the lease agreement between Mr. Brown and Mary Ann, as well as the emails confirming that Mr. Brown had no intention of selling the land. He pointed out the lack of any written agreement supporting Westland's claim and highlighted their aggressive tactics, including the unauthorized removal of Mary Ann's home and the repeated harassment of both her and Mr. Brown. Finally, Mr. Brown took the stand. He spoke plainly but firmly, recounting how representatives from Westland had pressured him to sell and how he had repeatedly refused. He described the fear and frustration he had felt over the past few weeks and made it clear that he had never agreed to vacate the land. As Mr. Brown stepped down, Mary Ann couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Despite everything he had been through, he had stood his ground. Now it was up to the judge to decide. There was a tense silence as the judge reviewed the evidence and listened to the final arguments. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Given the lack of any formal agreement supporting Westland's claim and the evidence presented by the defendants, I see no reason to lift the injunction at this time. The injunction will remain in place until the legal ownership of the property is determined. Furthermore, I find Westland's actions in removing Miss McDougall's home without proper notice to be deeply troubling. I will be referring this matter to the appropriate regulatory authorities for further investigation." A wave of relief washed over Mary Ann as the judge's words sank in. They had won, at least for now. Westland couldn't continue their development, and their tactics were finally being scrutinized by higher authorities. Karen's smug expression had disappeared, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. She stormed out of the courtroom without a word, her legal team trailing behind her. Outside the courthouse, Mr. Brown turned to Mary Ann, a weary but genuine smile on his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I couldn't have done this without you." "We're not done yet," she reminded him. "But this is a good start." Peter joined them a moment later, looking pleased but cautious. This was a big win, but don't let your guard down. Westland isn't going to give up. They'll regroup and try something else. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. Mary Ann nodded, knowing he was right. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks she felt like they had a real chance. They had faced down Westland's intimidation tactics and come out on top. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give her hope. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun set, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. This battle had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also shown her what she was capable of. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for her home, for Mr. Brown, and for everyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. And she wasn't going to stop until they won. She didn't know what Westland's next move would be, but she knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, she would be ready. In the days following the court hearing, Mary Ann allowed herself a cautious sense of relief. The injunction had bought them time, and with the court referring Westland's actions to regulatory authorities, it felt like a turning point. Yet she knew better than to assume the fight was truly over. Westland had too much invested in this project to walk away quietly. Karen Whitmore wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. If anything, Mary Ann expected them to shift tactics, perhaps try something even more underhanded. Sure enough, just 2 days later, Mr. Brown called her again, his voice tense. "You won't believe this," he said. "I just got a letter from Westland's lawyer. They're offering me a settlement. If I agree to sell the land now, they'll pay above market value and drop all claims. They're even offering to cover my legal fees." Mary Ann wasn't surprised, but the brazenness of the offer still made her blood boil. "They're trying to buy their way out of trouble," she said. "If you sell, they'll sweep everything under the rug and continue their project like nothing happened." "I figured as much," Mr. Brown agreed. "I'm not planning to take it, but it's tempting, I won't lie. They're offering a lot of money, and after everything they've put us through, part of me just wants this whole mess to be over." Mary Ann could hear the weariness in his voice. He wasn't a young man, and the stress of the past few weeks had clearly taken its toll. She couldn't blame him for considering the offer, but she also knew that giving in now would only reward Westland's bullying tactics. "Think it over," she said gently. "But if you're willing to keep fighting, I'll be right there with you. We've already come this far. Don't let them win now." Mr. Brown sighed. "You're right. We'll keep going. Let's see what your lawyer has to say." Peter was equally unimpressed by the offer when Mary Ann informed him. "Typical corporate play," he said. "They know they're in a weak position legally, so they're trying to buy their way out before the investigation digs too deep. Honestly, this could work in our favor. If we decline the settlement and push for a formal investigation, it could expose more of their tactics." By the end of the week, word had spread through the local community about the legal battle. Several nearby residents, many of whom had dealt with their own issues involving land disputes and aggressive development tactics, reached out to Mary Ann and Mr. Brown, offering support. Some even shared stories of how Westland had tried to pressure them into selling their properties. It quickly became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Westland had a pattern of using intimidation and questionable methods to acquire land for their projects. With this new information, Peter began building a broader case, one that extended beyond Mary Ann and Mr. Brown's situation. The goal wasn't just to win their case, but to expose Westland's entire operation. The investigation gained momentum when a local journalist picked up the story, bringing more attention to Westland's practices. Public pressure mounted, and soon local officials who had previously remained silent were forced to address the growing controversy. Facing mounting scrutiny and the risk of a full-scale regulatory investigation, Westland finally folded. Their legal team reached out to Peter, this time offering a far more reasonable settlement. They would pay for the full restoration of Mary Ann's mobile home, cover all legal expenses, and agree to a permanent injunction preventing any future development on Mr. Brown's land. In exchange, they wanted the lawsuit dropped and no further legal action pursued. After careful consideration, Peter advised Mary Ann and Mr. Brown to accept. "This is as close to a total victory as we're going to get," he said. "We've stopped their development, protected the land, and forced them to take responsibility for what they did. If we push further, we risk dragging this out for months or even years, and there's no guarantee we'll get a better outcome." Reluctantly, but knowing it was the right choice, they agreed. The settlement was finalized, and true to their word, Westland paid for the full restoration of Mary Ann's home. A local contractor was hired to bring it back to its original state, and within weeks, her home was returned to the plot of land she had fought so hard to protect. On the day her home was finally restored, Mr. Brown joined her for a quiet celebration. They stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over the forest that bordered the property. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mary Ann felt a genuine sense of peace. "You did good, kid," Mr. Brown said with a smile. "Couldn't have done this without you." "We did it together," she replied, grateful for his strength and resolve. "And now maybe things can finally go back to normal." It wasn't a perfect ending. Westland's tactics had left scars, both physical and emotional, and Mary Ann knew that she would always carry the memory of this fight with her. But she had learned something important through it all, that standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they seemed, was always worth it. She had fought for her home, for Mr. Brown, and for the principle that people shouldn't be pushed around by corporations that thought they were untouchable. And in the end, she had won. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to appear, Mary Ann allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. She had faced down impossible odds, and she had come out stronger. Whatever the future held, she knew she could handle it. After all, she had already taken on the worst and won,